Okay, I think why don't we just get started and people can catch up as they join. Hello everybody. Welcome to this evening's or afternoon's or morning's event, wherever you are, focused on food, the COP, the past and the future, organised by Table. So, for those of you who don't know us, Table's a platform for knowledge and dialogue on the future of food. We're led by Oxford, where I'm based, but in collaboration with a number of other universities in Europe and Latin America. So, Table looks at food system debates and tries to understand how stakeholders' evidence and values inform often conflicting visions and arguments for change, and we offer space for thoughtful and constructive dialogue within the food community. So, this evening's event is being held in the run-up to the 30th United Nations conference, and we're using it as an opportunity to pause and to reflect. So, during the course of this evening, we'll be discussing the past, so how thinking and most importantly, action on food systems have developed over the past 30 years and what progress has and hasn't been made. And also connected to that, how far the needs and the impacts of the food system have been incorporated into thinking and action, specifically when it comes to COP negotiations and commitments, but within a wider framework of international negotiations and commitments. And then we'll be looking at the future. So we're looking forward to the next 30 years and asking, where do we need to be when it comes to food in 30 years' time, and indeed in 5 years and 10 years' time? So to achieve that, what role could and should the COP do and other international processes to helping advance those goals? So that's the format of the evening, and I'm really delighted to have an excellent and very experienced panel of speakers joining us. They'll give a bit more flavour about their work during the discussions. And we'll be posting their full bios in the chat. So I'm going to be quite brief in my introductions here. So in no particular order, we have Mateus Alves Zanella, who is Senior Advisor for Global Fora at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And he's responsible for coordinating the Alliance's strategy in a range of international food negotiations, including but not limited to the Climate COP. Alessia Motaro, who's the Food and Land Use Coalition's Head of International Policy Engagement. Alessia leads their advocacy efforts to influence legislation and provides technical assistance to governments on evidence-informed policy design. And then Oliver Camp, who's part of the Policy and External Relations team at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN. So Oliver works at the intersection of human health and environmental sustainability in food systems and is a long-standing viewer and commentator on COP and other negotiations. And Oliver produces some incredibly useful resources on everything you may and indeed may not want to know about the COP, which we're posting in the chat. So the first 50 minutes of this evening is going to be taken up with just a panel, fairly free-flowing panel discussion among the speakers. And then for the final 35 minutes, we'll open out into a Q&A. If you do have questions for the panelists, just post them in the Q&A while you're at it. Please don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A where I'll see them. And then finally, as you may know, because a sign comes up, the event is being recorded, and do please pass on the recording to anyone who is interested and who may not have made this evening. So anyway, on to the discussion, and there may be an unwanted entrance by my cat because it's his dinner time. It's not really his dinner time, but he thinks it is. So please excuse me if I had to kind of push him off the table. So just to kick off, just a couple of minutes each, and we agreed we'd go in alphabetical order. So you, Alessia, to start first. Could you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and your work? Say a little bit about how you ended up working on food and food systems, and I know that you all take and emphasize a systems approach, but which little bit of it is the bit that you find most interesting and that you work on most intensely? And yeah, over to you, Alessia.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tara. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion among friends. My name is Alessia. I'm the Director of International Policy Engagement for the Food and Land Use Coalition, as you mentioned. FOLU is a group of 9 international partners and 7 country platforms that got together in 2017 to accelerate the food systems transition. And very much like Table, we realized that there were a few topics in the food systems transition that really needed a consultative multi-stakeholder approach to answer them because there are inherent values and trade-offs that need to be made. And so we focus on trying to answer those trade-offs through knowledge and engagement, including with policymakers, businesses, and the financial institutions. In terms of my background, I actually started off my career as a lobbyist in Brussels for the food industry and fell in love with the topic of food systems, but hated working for the food industry, with no offense to all the many businesses that do wonderful work in this space. But I thought I needed to redeem my soul, so I've spent the last decade basically working and supporting governments, working with and supporting governments to try and design effective food systems policies, and that's everything from the UK and Mexico's obesity strategy to looking at smallholder farmer commercialization in East Africa, to most recently working at the global level. And the question that I'm really excited about and thinking about deeply at the moment is, how do we channel finance back into the hands of farmers to implement some of those on-farm nature-based solutions that we know would be beneficial for both climate resilience, mitigation, livelihoods, et cetera, and how do we manage some of the trade-offs in terms of productivity? Are they really trade-offs? Is there really a land-sparing, land-sharing debate? And I know many people on this call will have thought deeply about that topic. So excited to hear what comes out of this discussion.
Thanks, Alessia. Mateus, over to you, if you give us your background and story.
Thank you very much, Tara. Thank you for the invitation. It's really good to be among friends. I didn't know about your past, Alessia. That's a very interesting piece of information. So I am Senior Advisor for the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. The Global Alliance is a strategic alliance of philanthropic organizations. So we are grant makers, we are funders. We support people in the ground, organizations, initiatives. But what really unites this almost 30 organizations is the understanding that we do need to transform the food systems that we have. The understanding that the food systems, broadly speaking, they're not actually delivering the goals that society associate with that in terms of food security, climate protection, resilience, biodiversity, etc. And that we really have to profoundly transform those systems towards something else. And we are always discussing with partners what does that mean, this something else. A little bit about myself. I think I entered into the food system work. I'm from Brazil, so I was beginning my career in the early 2000s. And I followed the waves, if I can say like this. Brazil was expanding its agro exports in the early 2000s, actually really integrating their value chains in global food commodity chains. And there seems to be some sort of interesting place to be at that time. It was during the WTO negotiations, for example, the Doha round and etc. So that was my entrance point. I went through trade, more specifically trade and environment. Later, once trade the discussions on trade declined, trade continued, but discussions on trade negotiations halted. Many of my colleagues also look at sides. So what's the next wave? And the next wave seemed to be this food system approach, what we now encompasses all the different dimensions of the food systems, including aspects of nutrition, biodiversity protection, climate, and became much more broader and comprehensive than the narrow view of trade that I began. I later became involved in gastronomy projects. I went for the business of restaurants. I became a chef. I had a small business. I closed business during pandemic, and then decided that I had to return to this world of food systems. And I think it's good timing. There's a lot of engagement and interaction. And to conclude, what really interests me right now, I think there's an emerging discussion on how to finance ideas. How can we actually move from thinking to action? And philanthropic organizations, they carry resources, right? But I think what really qualifies them is that they carry very nimble and flexible resources, much smaller than the public and private finance channels, much smaller, but much more flexible. So I'm helping these organizations to understand what are opportunities for leveraging, so small investments that can trigger big changes. And most of those are on connecting actors in the ground, family farmers, indigenous groups, with international financing channels. So this is where I'm looking at right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mateus. Oliver.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm a long-time beneficiary of all of Table's work, so it's nice to now be a participant in some of the work. So yeah, I'm Oliver Camp. I'm part of the policy team at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Many of you will know GAIN, but we work mainly in low and middle income countries. We have 12 country offices across Africa and Asia. We work on policy, we work on programs, and we work on research, basically to enable food systems transformation. And as the name suggests, primarily with nutrition in mind, but of course, not exclusively with nutrition in mind. We understand that there are these deep connections between nutrition and food security, climate resilience and adaptation, and increasingly climate mitigation as well. So that's what GAIN does. We're also the co-hosts of an initiative called the Initiative on Climate Action in Nutrition, which launched during COP27 under the presidency of the government of Egypt. And that's now a really major part of my work, because that's an opportunity for us to make really explicitly some of those connections between climate and nutrition within not only the UNFCCC framework, but also looking beyond to other climate and biodiversity related agendas. And of course, on the other side, the food security and nutrition world as well. So ICANN is a big part of my work, and I'm lucky enough to work with Alessia in the Food and Land Use Coalition as well. Then what got me into this space? Well, a bit like you, Alessia, I was in the private sector and consultancy previously, but maybe I had a slightly better experience than you, by the sound of it, in that I was lucky enough to work with very good people, including people at Unilever. And I think Unilever is often held up as one of the businesses that is most serious about business as a force for good and trying to do the right thing in the world. And I saw people who I really recognized as having all the best intentions, who recognized the issues that we have in the food system. Nice to see your cat has arrived, Tara. And yet found it difficult, even working for the biggest and second biggest food businesses in the world, to really change the way that things worked. There were things we could do around the edges, things we could do around the peripheries, but making that kind of systemic, holistic change that we know is necessary was impossible even for the largest businesses in the world. So I thought I would make this switch over to a development organization where we have the opportunity to work, of course, still with the private sector where that's relevant and necessary, but also with policymakers, also with the financial institutions, also with civil society, to see how we can accelerate change, not just by changing behavior within these organizations, but by changing the systems, the incentives, the regulation and the policy that surrounds the systems so that we're able to accelerate progress. And then finally, what's my priority? Well, of course, it's really to make this connection across nutrition and climate change, and above all, to tap into the co-benefits that exist. There are so many actions, and this is very fortunate for us all, that are good for both nutrition and food security and climate change outcomes. And so that is where we should focus and prioritize, because we can do so much more when we take that integrated approach. So that's all from me, Tara. Thank you.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. So two of you have, indeed all three of you have some kind of private sector background, however one defines it, and you've all been in sort of different parts of the jigsaw of the food system, if that's the right metaphor. And I suppose over the course of your careers, you've had your own sort of journey of change and progress, perhaps, and then you've also seen the food system and the discussions and the actors and the configurations of activity around the food system changing. And I mean, perhaps you haven't all been working on food for 30 years, but for certainly for a good chunk of that time. And I'd be really interested to know how you feel the discussion has changed. I mean, just speaking personally, when I first started working on food, which kind of was 30 years ago, there wasn't a food system, there was a supply chain at best. And over the course of our, of thinking and acting and this idea of a system, which is about relationships as well as just the activities that kind of join the dots, became more current and perhaps a more useful way of looking at things. So I'd be really interested to know how you feel, firstly, the discussion and the rhetoric has changed, and also offering some kind of global north, global south comparison. And then when it comes to the action in actual progress, and then connected to that, and you can treat this separately or you can weave it in together, what the role of the COP, in your view, has been in influencing or at least interfacing with with those trends. So this is basically a free flowing discussion. So whoever wants to kind of chip in first, go for it.
I could start if people are quiet.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Oliver. No, I think you framed it very nicely, Tara. There is the thinking has changed, and I think the systems approach really became mainstream today, understanding how food should be governed. What I think has not yet happened, and that's my point for discussion with colleagues, the communities are still very fragmented and isolated with each other. Like my career, I was saying, started with trade, then during the time that I was looking for something else, there was a big revolution in global food governance with the renovation, the reform of the Committee on World Food Security, 2009. There was the big debates on land grabbing, on responsible investments, and there was some sort of a food security, food and nutrition community, which revolved around those topics and became quite well structured and powerful, surrounding the Committee on Food Security, 2009, 2010, 11, 12. At the same time, the discussions on climate were beginning, on agriculture and climate were beginning to emerge, but from a different background. And it seems that there's other communities that are discussing more specific topics, health, agrochemical transition, agroecology, etc., etc. It seems that everyone else feels part of the same family, but there is very little talking between those two family members. Like we navigate some of those spaces. We participate in CFS meetings every year. We try to go to all COPs, etc. And it's still striking how these communities, they do not know each other. They carry different objectives. They carry different understandings of the world. And what might be a good question for discussion is what are the good and bad implications of that, right? I think one of the good implications, because it is complex, we cannot have one single meeting that you discuss all the single topics. But I think one of the bad implications is it becomes quite exclusive to be able to navigate all those different spaces. You have to have a lot of capacity and resources, and that excludes a lot of organizations who do not have those resources. So they tend to specialize in one or another meeting, and they tend to do the most out of it, because having someone which has, for example, Oliver's capacity of having understanding of all the different frames and having a document which simplifies everything, very few organizations do have those resources. And it's some sort of a exclusive club. It's not very good for grassroots organizations, for example.
Can I just ask, because you say that people are all in their separate little silos, and for obviously reasons, because even within those silos, there's a lot of complexity. Do you feel that the fragmentation breeds hostility or simply ignorance or a bit of both?
Quick reaction. I think it's a bit of both, and there's competition between those forums, resources for funding those forums, for funding conversations. So it's not hostility in the sense they disagree with each other, but if you are specialized on a topic and your organization is investing on it, of course you want to protect the space where these discussions are happening, right? And you might see that other spaces are threatening these discussions. And sometimes they do. Like we can actually bring a few practical examples in the conversation. So I think it's a bit of both. It's not people don't want to have those conversations, but there is this dynamic happening, which, like I said, has negative consequences.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to you because I want to ask you about your perception of what progress there's been, but I just want to ask Oliver or Alessia if you want to come in at this point.
Shall I go, Alessia? I'm
Yes.
sure we both have thoughts. Yeah, thanks, Tara. Well, yeah, I take a reasonably kind of charitable view to this because it is such a complex area. Maybe just to rewind to the beginning of your question, Tara. I mean, if you look back a long way, 60 years rather than 30 years, then we're still in the territory of trying to produce more foods to head off world hunger as being the key issue facing us. And in a sense, the food system that we created was fantastically successful at doing that, at addressing hunger, at producing sufficient food, but had some negative externalities that were maybe underappreciated or maybe ignored at that time. And then maybe over the last 30 years, or perhaps a little bit less, sort of accelerating over the last 30 years, we've needed to somewhat unpick that system again so that we can rewire some of it in order to address some of those externalities. And that's where I think we are today. We're in a situation where we have an unbelievable food system, which is feeding more people than ever before. Last year, contrary to what we might think with climate disasters around the world, we produced more food in just absolute quantity of calories than we've ever produced before as a species. So it's a pretty extraordinary thing. But of course, now we need to change, well, pretty much everything. We need to change what we produce. We need to change how we produce it. We need to address how it's distributed and how it moves around, particularly so we can address food loss and waste. And we need to address in turn what we all eat to make sure that our diets, one way or another, are either more healthy or more diverse or some combination of both. So then how do you do that? When you've got a system where everyone has got their different role within this complex system, and as Matthias, I think, very rightly says, it's very difficult for any one person to have a full understanding of the full system. How do you work together better? And I think that's the work in progress. One of the things we see is that COP has become, to some extent, the sort of World Cup final, right? Where we all think we're going to get together and, win the game. I think that can make it a bit unwieldy. I think that COP has become complex and you hear a bit of everything during the COP. And I think we need to be sympathetic to the climate negotiators, to the policymakers and so on who are there engaging at the COP just with this avalanche of information. So it's this case of having to simplify complexity for ourselves and for the actors, the policymakers, the businesses, the civil society members and so on, who are then going to carry on the work that is started sometimes through these multilateral processes. And that's no easy thing. I think the effort is good, the will is there, but it's a tough challenge. And I'm sure that's what we'll unpack a bit more in this conversation.
Just to hold that thought, just in terms of that complexity and this dynamic between, on the one hand, and again, you kicked off that, Matthias, this idea that you can really focus on things if you look at things specifically, but then you need to broaden out, and if you broaden out, it becomes too unwieldy and sort of fluffy in a sense, and so you have to. There's always that dynamic. The other connection to that is this question of being inclusivity and who's involved in the discussions. And you come with a private sector, some aspect of the private sector background, and now you're also focusing more on kind of local peoples, rights of indigenous peoples, for example, as part of the Global Alliance. And again, how to incorporate those different perspectives, how you balance those two different perspectives, and the extent to which that leads to meaningful decision making are all questions I really want to get into. But let's just turn to Alessia first.
Thanks, Tara. I mean, those are all fascinating questions, and I don't want to take us too far away from those, but I did want to just answer your question about how has the COP process itself changed. And I don't know how many people on this call are super familiar with the COP, so apologies if I'm not hitting the mark on level of complexity or simplicity here, but I can't go back 30 years on COPs, but I can say that in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, we've seen a massive evolution in how food systems has landed at the COP. Some of you may remember the joint working group, the Coronivia joint working group, and then the Sharm el-Sheikh, and Oliver is an expert on these, he can tell you more about them. But from my perspective, they were sort of the seeds of the conversation, right? Really saying that agriculture needed to be part of the conversation and fostering dialogue among countries on what the food systems issues really were and trying to shape what the agenda at the COP should be. And we've seen these processes continue up until today and will continue at this COP. But they were only the beginning from our perspective. What we've been trying to do since then is really try and positions food systems as a holistic topic on the agenda, not just mitigation, reducing emissions from fertilizer, in that very specific way, but rather talking about the complex interactions between climate and food in a much more holistic way. And our hope is that we contributed to that at COP28 when we landed the Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Food Systems. And the aim of that declaration was really to get broad range acknowledgement from all the countries of the complexity of those interactions. And of course, one can challenge the process and say, what's the benefit of a declaration? Well, it's not an implementation tool by any means, but it does set a standard. It does set a sort of basic commonality among countries, basic understanding that we can then also, as a civil society community, hold countries to. So that for us was a very big moment. And then what we've seen since then, especially last year, was food systems land not only at the climate COP, but also increasingly at the UNCCD COP with the Riyadh Action Agenda, and then at the UNCBD COP in Colombia last year as well. And of course, biodiversity and agriculture have always had strong interactions, but we see those growing as well. So what we're hoping for this year, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but it is to consolidate further what that Emirates Declaration really means. What is the change that we're looking for countries to adopt? Oliver and I have had many, dinner conversations about what does progress really look like, and to your point, what level of specificity can we really hope to achieve at the COPs? What are the limitations of a multilateral process? But I think the hope is to get kind of, if you think of like the energy transition, into more and more specificity and concreteness about the solutions that we're looking to adopt, where and how. Of course, the food system is much more complex, right? It's not adopt solar panels everywhere. We can't say any solution should be adopted anywhere because there's so much geographical diversity, diversity by value chains, by farmer groups, by traditional local indigenous practices. So that's the complexity that we deal with. But I think the question in the space that we're in now is, how do we advance specificity without getting into the space of meaningless simplicity? And I think that's really the challenge that you're referring to as well.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that could go off in a million directions. I just wanted to sort of go back to this question. I mean, it's the point that you've made. When a statement is so general that it feels bland, and a cynic might say, well, what does it achieve? And then you have all sorts of different actors that are trying to pull it and push it in different directions. Can you think, and this opens out to all of you, can you think of a past statement of that nature which has actually led to kind of concrete action that one can point to and say, yes, these sorts of general declarations do actually lead to some kind of action, measurable action or discernible action that one can see a few years hence?
Well, I mean, Tara, I'm very positive about this. I think that they certainly do. The entire point with the UNFCCC, at least the negotiated agenda, is that at COPs, between them indeed, we come to agreements at the multilateral level about things that we all think we should work on together. The countries can all say these are priorities for, the human species for 198 countries. And that's a pretty extraordinary achievement, given how much we disagree on globally between all these countries. To come together and agree, we need to take action on these specific areas. We need to take action in this way. Sometimes we have these shared priorities. I think that's already a brilliant achievement, which is why I think the COP is so important and so useful. But then all of this is governed by so-called CBDRC, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, which means that countries kind of choose their own adventure. They are allowed to go away and come up with their own NDCs, their national climate plans, and their own national adaptation plans. And they do that in a way that suits their circumstances. So I agree with the conversation we were just having about the huge breadth of all of the different multilateral processes and all of the complexity of navigating global food governance. At least one thing that can be said is that the funnel on the other side is relatively narrow, and that is the national level policies where this all comes to life. Yeah. So what's really important is that when we go and get a global declaration or a global agreed outcome text from a COP or whatever, we don't just leave it there and say, okay, we can go on then, countries can just go and crack on. We then go and get hands-on in countries, co-designing in the context-specific way what those actions should be. And I think that happens routinely. I mean, I think that is the dynamic we have between the multilateral processes and the national processes. So to the premise of your question, I mean, that is exactly the model that I think we're trying to pursue.
Yeah. Yeah. Mateus, do you want to come in at all?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. No, I was just going to say that I also think that words matters, and I also think that declarations do as well. I think they channel a few things. One, by showing the political direction where a certain group of actors, meaning governments, are going, it aligns the incentives that people might be expecting. And that also has implications for example, how the finance flows are organized. Our own philanthropic community looks for those as directionality for allocating investments. And if there's a declaration that is highlighting a little bit more strongly the case for adaptation and resilience, which is the case of the declaration that we'll be expecting this year on hunger and poverty, I'm quite sure that the philanthropic actors will also redirect some of those resources more towards this type of project. So yes, there is implications for funding, I would say. But I think it's connected to the point that I think it's on the Q&A, a very important question: do governments really have the most power in the room, right? I think policy matters a lot, but I think an agenda that the COP, not only COP, but COP Climate and COP Land and COP Diversity, but other international fora have not yet managed to address, is the agenda of incentives for the private sector. How do we actually account for all the externalities? How do we measure those? How do we change our policies based on those? There is ongoing discussions on reforming subsidies, for example, for 30 years. I started seeing the first papers by think tanks on that in my early career, and we have seen very little progress. Right now, we're seeing some advances. So I think this way of how do we channel the private sector in this or that direction? How do we close certain business because there are too much costs? I think this agenda is still very, very immature compared to others. So I don't think the COP is actually the place where these discussions are taking place. Yeah, stop there.
As in, you don't think they're the place. Where do you think these discussions are taking place then?
Coming back to my background on trade, one of the big people are saying very proudly of the WTO in the early days that we have a panel for sanctions, and a country can be sanctioned based on the multilateral system. We know that all the system is in collapse right now, and the COPs they carry this very interesting approach, like Oliver was explaining, is NDCs. Show me what you're doing. We're gonna mash it up all the plans together, and we see where we're getting at. So there is very little capacity for the multilateral system to impose policy change, to impose private sector change. I think this is the from thinking to action that I was bringing the first comment. Is the thinking has evolved, the action has not evolved as much as the thinking on food systems. And there's a big implementation gap there that we have to discuss.
Yeah. We also hear, obviously, when you're looking at the kind of the energy sector, you hear a lot about the lobbying of the fossil fuels companies and in the fossil fuels nations in kind of providing obstacles to progress. Do you feel that that sort of thing is happening also with respect to the food industry, the agri-food industry, when it comes to COP discussions?
Alessia?
Look, I've seen the worst of the food industry for sure. And I have to say, I see it much less at the COPs than I have in other environments and other spaces. And I think the food industry has shown up in a very positive and constructive way in the last few years. I'm sure it does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, but part of FOLU's membership includes the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as well as the World Farmers Organization. And, my deepest belief is that both of these organizations are deeply committed to the food systems transition. And even when, we face challenging topics internally and externally, such as, should we reduce herd sizes? well, that there's at least room for that conversation, and I think that's the most important thing. It's not about I think, you know, how this relates to your question about how the COPs are changing is, I think the civil society community used to play a much more advocacy drumbeat role of you must, you know, impose vegetarianism and you must, you know. And I think we're moving into a much more nuanced space, which is much more healthy and much more interesting. And I think there's a lot of voices in that space that are contributing in a collaborative and constructive way. And I do see that happening much more. I mean, I don't know if other colleagues agree, but that's my impression.
Yeah, maybe if I can add, I mean, as much as I joke about it, Alessia, I very much agree with you. And it's easy to overstate the role that some of these actors play. When we see the headlines about there being however many hundreds of big food actors at COPs, I think we shouldn't immediately assume that means they have huge influence. I don't think that necessarily means they're whispering in the ears of the negotiators and determining what is achieved. Often they're there to do, you know, some of the bit that comes around the COP, the sort of trade show around the COP, which is a perfectly reasonable way to engage. I think there is some kind of lobbying and private sector action which goes too far and that can be unhelpful. But to a very large degree, I'm very keen that we move beyond this kind of goodies and baddies, winners and losers kind of narrative where you have these bad actors, and if it weren't for them, then the whole world would be in a much better place. Because I think, as Alessia says, the truth is much more nuanced and complicated than that. And the worry is that, you know, we don't want businesses, small or large, but maybe especially small farmers, you know, SMEs and food value chains in Africa and Asia where we work. We don't want them to fail. We don't want them to have massive hits to either their cost increases, or massive hits to their profits because of new impositions of new policies and regulation that they find it hard to keep up with. So we do need to work with them in order to find the solutions which are technically feasible, politically acceptable, and economically viable, while also being good for health and nutrition and the environment. I find it hard to imagine how we could do that in a completely exclusive way, but obviously there does need to be a line drawn, and we do all draw a line in terms of when we won't engage with the private sector, when we do think that their interests are not aligned to what we're trying to achieve on health and sustainability and so on. It's just about where you draw that line. And, you know, I think drawing it at private sector shouldn't be involved at all is unhelpful, but anything goes is also unhelpful. And I'm sure there are lots of points on the spectrum in between.
Thank you. So, okay, so I would like to kind of turn to the future in a minute, but I just want to see if I can sort of try and summarize. No, I can't, the conversation, but broadly speaking, you know, I asked you what progress you felt had been made over the last 30 years or whatever. And I think that the answer you gave, and I think I would like to have a little bit more of a specific answer on this actually, is that where we have come, we have made huge progress in the sense that more people have access to more calories, and we have addressed some of the kind of the major problems of the past around absolute hunger, and calorie deficits, etc., in the world today. So we have made some progress on that. We've also made, but we're now sort of the victims of our success in terms of the quality of that food. We've made some progress in terms of the incorporation of thinking about food into the COP and indeed the other spaces where these discussions happen. There has been progress that can and hopefully will lead to tangible action at the country level, and that the discussion has moved away from a kind of yes, no, good, bad towards more of the like, okay, how do we do this in practice? So those are the sort of, that's the positive. If there was another person on this panel discussion, might be able to say what you call a nuanced discussion, I call a cop out, that there is that dynamic, and that people who say we need to hold the red lines in a way that is going to lead to a kind of remove any scope for greenwash, which is obviously something that is a close bedfellow of nuance. But so maybe we can focus on that a bit. What I would really like is to get a sense of where you feel an example of tangible progress that has led towards better nutrition or climate outcomes that you have seen in the last 30 years over and above the, yes, well, people are, and I'm not discounting that, people are less likely to be malnourished than they were at other points in history. And then I would also like to just, as a way of kind of segueing a bit into the future, is ask questions about the role of consumption when thinking about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and some of the targets that we need to hit, and then move forward into thinking about, okay, if 30 years is the kind of arbitrary look forward, where will we need to be in 5 years or 10 years to get onto that path? Alessia, you've got all the answers, I hope. Yeah.
None of the answers, but more questions that I hope are thought-provoking. I just wanted to come to your point, Tara, about, okay, guys, but what have we really achieved at the COPs? And I think part of what the three of us are saying, being sort of maybe COP veterans, is, well, what can you really expect from a COP? And I think that's part of the answer. I think where the real, let's say, results lie are at a country level.
Yeah.
So how do the countries then absorb some of this information and change their own national practices? I think it's important, though, before we look at the countries, to just caveat that for a long time, the COP process has been focused on negotiations, which are a minimum common deliverable approach, right? We need to get everybody to move together to get to here. And that's basically like the worst link in the chain kind of approach. And it's not the most exciting approach if you're thinking about dealing with climate change, which is an impending issue that we all feel strongly about that needs to be addressed yesterday. What I do think we're seeing, which is quite interesting, is a move away from the minimum common denominator approach to a much sort of more focused, high ambition approach. So some of the countries moving away from the pack and saying, you know what, you guys can keep negotiating down here, but we're already showing you that this is possible. And part of what we've been trying to do as FOLU is foster that. And one of the initiatives that we've launched in this regard is something called the Alliance of Champions for Food Systems Transition, which is a group of really small, like a small group of really ambitious countries who are not your usual suspects, or not even the countries that you think would need to transition, but who are really committed to food systems change and who are demonstrating what possible looks like. And so to give you an example, one of the countries that we work a lot with as part of the Alliance is Sierra Leone. Tiny country. For those of you who know the history of Sierra Leone, has a complex history of civil war and has a really ambitious president and minister of agriculture who see agriculture fundamentally as the engine of growth, but also as a more positive, green and sustainable future for Sierra Leone. And we've been working with them in the last few years on their Feeds Alone strategy, which is their main core national priority, which is all around basically how do we produce more domestically to feed our local population and also create opportunities for neighboring countries and neighboring markets to import critical commodities that they need, like onions, like rice, and other things. And they have created these, just to give you an example of rice, these industrial rice production zones that are basically for rice washing and rice draining and supporting the commodification of the rice supply chain. But they're also deeply committed to sustainable rice production. So they've just raised over $1 billion last year to try and intensify production in a really sustainable way, working with some of the leading partners in this space. Now, why have they done that? What's the role of the global community? Is it just national domestic priorities? Could they do it alone? Of course they could, but through the multilateral community, they have access to a few critical inputs. Number one, access to global knowledge and understanding of what good looks like. So what does sustainable rice intensification look like? What are the practices that could and should be adopted? Number two, access to financing. I think we forget that there are still massive global power imbalances, especially in the financial system. And the global community is now rallied around Sierra Leone and said, yes, we must support this example. But who was investing in Sierra Leone before? Not that many people. So they've had now access to this financing. And I think the third piece that this new kind of like forward-facing approach allows is knowledge sharing between the countries. So you're no longer discussing about a common denominator of what is the minimum of what we should be doing, but rather what does great look like and how do we do great? And now we're thinking about how do we scale Sierra Leone's example to other countries? How do we bring this kind of perspective? And we've been trying to do this in Ethiopia with looking at oilseed supply chains and how to make them a sustainable alternative to palm oil imports, for example. So I think this is it's an exciting prospect for us to move and possibly part of our conscious or subconscious shift away from the negotiation agenda more into the climate action agenda more broadly, to really think about what more is possible within the COP system. So sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I did want to give you an example you could hang on to of
that's
what
absolutely
success
fascinating.
looked like.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just Oliver, Mateus, do you want to? Oh, look, Mateus, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
I was just going to build on Alicia's excellent point that this move from negotiation to everything else that the COP system provides, I think it's very welcoming. There is a very interesting interview in the Brazilian media today with the COP presidency, the president himself, Ambassador André, and he was saying, do not measure the result of the COP by the cover text. Of course, he's putting out of his own responsibility because it's his responsibility to produce a cover text. But I think it's a very good message in the sense that you cannot believe that 100,000 people, well, maybe this year is a little bit less, go to a conference and the only thing that matters is what is negotiated by 150 people, which is the text, or 2,500 diplomats, which is the package of negotiations. What are the other 97,500 people doing? So of course, there's a lot of different things taking place in what has become the World Cup final, as Oliver was pointing out, a place of gathering, a place of announcements, and also a place of exchange, knowledge, information, financing, technology selling, etc., etc. All of that package, what I consider at least the COP process, is very relevant. And maybe the most relevant things are outside of the negotiation room, such as working with high ambition countries to help them to foster and be even more ambitious and implement their opportunities. And I think this leads back to our conversation with the private sector that I would like to pick up again. I think we have to find a similar approach with them as well. Like there's still a lot of conversation on how do we change the big ag and how do we, et cetera, et cetera. I personally think it's a waste of time. Like if we don't change the incentives, how are we going to actually convince them? They are business makers. They're going to play by the incentives. But there are progressive businesses emerging on a number of areas which carry a much more attuned type of economy for the climate challenge, for the food security challenge we have. And there are excellent examples. Like there is one group of people now that we're going to be feeding the participants of the COP with food from ecological produce, family farming, Brazilian social bioeconomy products, etc. These are businesses. These are people who are going to be feeding the producers and the participants of the COP, even the people who are going to be serving themselves. This is the kind of business that I think philanthropy at least should support. These are the new economy on bio inputs, the new economy on distribution channels, on agroecological produce. This is where actually I'm seeing most of the positive examples being formed.
Thank you. Oliver.
Maybe just briefly to pick up on that last point of Mateus and just to add one bit of evidence to your body of evidence, Tara. I definitely agree that the things we should be working on the most diligently now are the solutions which work within the existing economy that we already have. The Eat Lancet 2.0 report that many of you will have heard of, that came out a couple of weeks ago, it talks about sustainable ecological intensification practices, so ways that we can produce more nutritious food on less land with lower environmental impacts. And where we can do that in an economically viable way, just full steam ahead. We can go ahead and do those because there is no economic disincentive, there's no trade-off, it's all upside for all the actors, for the farmers, for the businesses, for the consumers, for the politicians, and so on. Then there's a wider category of issues where perhaps the policy and regulatory environment can change to change the incentives, as Mateus says, so that businesses can respond to those incentives in order that doing the right thing becomes economically viable Whereas at the moment, doing the wrong thing by health and sustainability, right, is often the thing that the economic incentives would lead you to do. So I really agree that that's a big part of our focus. And then just to add to the point about how COPs worked, what have we achieved? The most fundamental of all of the different indicators that we have is that the NDCs, well, before we had any NDCs, we were on a path to over 4 degrees of warming, which would have been utterly catastrophic. Now with the NDCs we're just below 2.5 degrees of warming. You may say 2.5 is still too high. It is, and we need to do much more, but 4 is unthinkable. So just in terms of what the COP itself set out to achieve so many years ago, or particularly with the Paris Agreement, of course, we have achieved such an enormous amount that I think it would be a mistake to dismiss that. Now we're in the territory of looking for all these co-benefits. How do we look for nature wins? How do we look for wins around deforestation, around food security and nutrition, and so on? And I think there's more to be done there. But its fundamental purpose has been a great success for multilateralism, even if there's still a lot more to be done.
Thank you. So there is more to be done. So let's look ahead and see what you feel the goals are for the next arbitrarily 30 years, but let's keep it to more the kind of 5 to 10 year time span. And also, I mean, the word finance has come up quite a few times in the discussion so far. So I'd really like to ask you a bit more about what sort of financing quantities and mechanisms and foci are needed to kind of kickstart all this, and what policy environment could help enable and incentivize that releasing of financial investment. Mateus.
If I may, I think there are 2 main wishes that we would like to have for the next 10 years. I think one of the big innovations of this COP is what's been called the action agenda, which is a set of implementation plans, a set of solutions for really delivering action on the ground. I think if this stays as some sort of a general structure that is carried through different COPs, so we don't have to reinvent the agenda every year, that would be a major, major outcome. And the second question is then, how do you finance that? How do you finance organizations to engage on that? I think it's not a secret for anyone, like we are big supporters of more engagement from frontline food leaders, not because of the moral imperative that we have to have a more justice system, but also because it makes a lot of sense. Like they are the ones who are not only facing the burdens of climate change, they are the ones who are having their harvest loss, they are the ones who are getting flooded, that they are the ones who are facing dry spells and etc., but only because they have the solutions. They are the ones who are in the ground innovating. And they are the least financed of all actors. I think there was a report recently came in that said the family farmers receive less than 0.36% of the whole package of climate finance. So addressing this question, I think, is fundamental. If we really want to substantially make that the action agenda is something that is structured and engaging, we have to find ways of channeling finance to those actors so they can participate in the implementation plans, be it at the national level, regional level, or international level.
Okay, and any other comments there? I mean, on who should be financing it, how much, and for whom?
Yeah, I mean, the financing question is obviously a challenge. Last year, as many of you will know, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance was agreed. So that was a slightly vaguer than hoped ambition for developed countries to mobilize $300 billion for developing countries, which, well, at least it was accompanied by the so-called Baku to Belém roadmap, which should be published any moment during COP, which was about how we would then take that 300 billion to 1.3 trillion. I guess the issue is a couple of things. Firstly, it's always been very difficult to meet any of these financial targets. We previously had a $100 billion target, which was only met in the latter years. That was an annual target. It was only met, I think, for the first time in 21, 22, was it? Forgive me if I'm confusing the year. And the argument about what the sources of finance are and what types of finance are being included, so at risk of being too complicated here, is it just grant finance from developed countries to developing countries, or is it things like concessional loans? Does it include private finance mobilized and so on? So there's an argument about that. And, looking at the global geopolitical situation at the moment, we know it's not a great moment for international development finance. So I wonder if this links back to our last conversation about the incentives within the system, so that the solutions effectively almost fund themselves, or can be funded by changing incentives and then being able to realign the way that private finance goes. Just to put it into perspective, we're talking about potentially 300 billion of climate finance, and annually at the moment there's something like $200 billion of ODA. The food system is sort of 20 trillion. That's the juggernaut that we're trying to shift. If you can turn around the system, then the finance is there within the system. It's throwing the finance at the system from the outside that is proving very difficult. We need to do both, of course, and that's especially so that we can do things like protect the most vulnerable. And IDA replenishment last year being reasonably good. That's the money that goes to the least developed countries. That was very encouraging, so that we can make sure that the WFP can continue the work of helping refugees in very poor areas with food handouts and so on. But I wonder if we should just try to think about allocating different types of finance to different causes, so that we can make the most of the diminishing resources that we have, while also mobilizing these bigger flows, public and private, so that we can really tackle the big issues.
Yeah. Alessia, do you want to chip in?
Jump in, because Oliver has created a perfect landing strip for me to talk about raise, which I think merits a few minutes, if I may. So exactly as Oliver's saying, one of the big questions that we've been tackling with as a food systems community is, how do you fund farmers to adopt more sustainable agricultural practices? And more importantly than that, how do you align incentives within the finance system to do that, so that you're not trying to fund this out of the goodness of our hearts, but that we're leveraging the private resources that exist to unlock capital at scale? One of the things that we will be launching this year, which has been a long collaboration with the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, is an initiative called Raise that tries to do exactly that. So at the moment, the way that regenerative agriculture is funded is that you have these very small, well, relatively speaking, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes, but relatively small impact funds that blend finance from philanthropy, from governments, from ODA, from impact investors, that try to basically create a pool of funding that has a diversity of risk and return profiles that can invest in a variety of projects. And then this kind of impact funding is invested in projects on the ground. Now that's great because it's very flexible and it allows us to really give money directly to projects. But it's very limited in size and scale, because you can imagine that a lot of financial institutions want to hold on to their money. So if you think of a bank, or if you think of a government and its national treasury, if you think of all the major financial institutions out there, businesses and corporates and their value chains, they're not easily going to let go of their funds and put it into a pooled impact fund. So the question that we've been trying to answer with Raise is, how do we get a government and a business and a bank and an insurance provider to co-invest? And Brazil has done this in a very interesting way through something called Eco-Invest. So this year they launched an auction round where the government, the Treasury, has basically put up about $3 billion in capital, which has been auctioned to commercial banks. So the banks have bid for this money and say, yeah, well, we'll take your 500 million of this, and we will lend it to our farmer customer base to implement these improved nature-based solutions. And they also add in some of their own private capital, and which totals about 6 billion in funding. Mm-hmm. And their current analysis suggests that they'll be able to restore about 3 million hectares of degraded land through this process. Now, this is a really interesting scheme for us, right? Because it starts to unpack not so much where do we need to invest and what do we need to invest in, but how do we mobilize? What are the mechanisms by which we get these actors to co-invest? And how do we align their interests? So what are the minimum viable conditions for investment that a government and a bank and a farmer can agree to? Mm. And so what Raise is going to try and do, and I'll share a few resources on it in a minute, is to help other governments to do the same. So it's a technical assistance facility that helps governments look at the state of their current financial system and finance flows to agricultural nature-based solutions, and then attract diverse groups of investors, whether it's guarantee providers, insurers, banks, ODA, MDBs, whoever it might be, to create more fiscal space for the government to lend, and then align private incentives to create these co-blended investments. So you're not blending at the fund level, but you're creating this mechanism and this structure for co-investment. That is what we feel will allow us to go from hundreds of millions of dollars to hundreds of billions of dollars, which is what we think we need to really reach scale. What is the function of the COP? Is the COP really the right place to do it? We don't know. We'll test it out. We'll see. The challenge is getting the financial institutions to the table. The businesses are there, the governments are there, the MDBs are there. But where are the global banks? Where are the insurers? There's a few really strategic players, the Rabobanks, the Howdens of this world, who are really committed and dedicated to this agenda. But we need more people to come to the table from the finance community to see climate not as a misaligned agenda, but as Oliver was saying, something that can really, A, secure supply chains and secure their investments, reduce risk, reduce the cost of capital, and then ultimately generate returns by just producing more food better in more countries more sustainably. So that's a challenge that we have, but we are proceeding nonetheless. We'll let you know post-COP how it goes, but this is our approach.
And do post those resources in the chat. I'm aware that we need to move over to questions now, rather belatedly. I'm going to randomly ask a question, and this kind of also links into questions of consumption that we haven't really talked about yet. Somebody called Matt Barkley asks, should we be calling for national leaders to address their own populations with clear information on key issues such as emissions, including emissions outsourced to other countries, particularly by rich countries, and the impact of meat and dairy on deforestation and climate, and also provide some leadership on lifestyle change? And you can answer that question, but I'll also ask perhaps the question of where and does, if, COP in relation to the questions of meat, where there's been quite, a lot of advocacy there, and on consumption and meat reduction. Oliver.
Yeah, I think it might be incumbent on me as the sort of nutrition person on the panel to have a go at the consumption question, the meat question as well, which is obviously a controversial topic. I'll upset someone. So the view that we take at GAIN, and I think it's a reasonably nuanced and reasonably widely held view, is that there is in the world a large category of people who are over-consumers, maybe generally, but let's say specifically of animal source foods or foods with a high environmental footprint. And clearly that consumption needs to come down a little. I'll come back to why in a minute. Then there's definitely a group, and this is often where GAIN works, of very low consumers of all kinds of things, just diets that have very, very minimal dietary diversity. They're not eating a range of fruits and vegetables or animal source foods. And clearly in those contexts, it would be inappropriate to start talking about getting rid of potentially highly nutritious animal source foods or any other kind of food for nutritional reasons. And then there's a large group in the middle, which is the sort of latent pent-up demand, where we think that as populations go up, as incomes rise, we will see more people wanting to shift their diets from those diets lacking in diversity towards diets with more diversity and more animal source foods. Now, do we need to reduce animal source food consumption? Do we need to tackle diets? Well, all the evidence says yes, right? All the evidence says there are huge benefits to be had for all kinds of things: health, environmental sustainability, land use, nature. If we shift what we eat, we have less animal source food, less beef particularly, more legumes, nuts and seeds, more fruit and veg, and so on. How do we then shape those interventions, right? And I think that's where we need to be nuanced and think about those different population groups. There is sort of intensive production to provide for people who are consuming huge amounts of meat. There you could intervene to try to shift those diets, maybe away from red meat towards alternatives, either the novel alternatives or plant-based foods, or even just shifting from, beef to chicken is relatively better. But obviously it would be inappropriate, as I said before, to do that in contexts where consumption is very, very low. You have more kind of small-scale pastoralist systems. And in fact, even we have evidence that in those systems, the animals can be playing a positive role for the land, for the environment, for nature, and so on. So it's a difficult question, and I hope that I'm presenting some of the nuance around this. Anything we do needs to be governed by the principles of a just transition and making sure that we're protecting the people who produce meat, people who depend on meat, and the people who would obviously be most affected. And just quickly to then round that out, the question specifically from, was it Matt? Sorry, thanks Matt for the question, was about national leadership. I mean, personally, I'd love to see a bit more kind of education from policymakers. It's a shame that these issues become politicized and used as a weapon, particularly where I live in the UK. It would be much more helpful if we could have a mature debate about how to reconcile what we need to do for environmental reasons with some of the trade-offs, the challenges, the things that people worry about to do with jobs, economy, and so on. I guess that there is a counter argument to that, which is it's a lot to take in and people might feel powerless to affect change if they just see these disastrous predictions about the future and then no opportunity to address those in their day-to-day lives. And kind of what's the point? I'm not sure I would go with that argument, but I think that we do need to make sure that we're clear about what we think people can do in their day-to-day lives and what we're trying to rely on governments, businesses, and financial institutions to work together to address. So I hope I'm not sitting on the fence too much, Tara.
Thank you. And I think we also get into questions of incentive structures and the environment within which people either make decisions or food, it's not a conscious thing necessarily anyway. So yeah. Shall I move, unless either of you have another comment on that, I can move on to another question? No? Okay. So driving, wait a minute. How will you, from Roxana Triboy, how will you stop food climate funds being captured by paperwork and overlapping EU schemes and ensure money reaches communities, especially indigenous peoples, rather than producing disposable reports? What accountability test will you use beyond deliverables? So yeah, it's actually how the money gets to the intended beneficiaries.
I can take a stab at this excellent but rather complex question. So paperwork has always been an issue with dispersing funds, and it will continue to be an issue. We have seen though some positive moves in that direction. So GCF, which is the Green Climate Fund, who funds a lot of work in the agriculture and restoration space, has been in the past notoriously complex to have grants and funds dispersed from. They have really made huge leaps and bounds of progress and have a commitment now to disbursement within, I believe it's 9 to 12 months. So we're seeing that issue being addressed, at least in terms of when it comes to climate funds. The EU subsidy system is completely different and complex. Many of you will know more about it than I do. But if my very outdated information is still accurate, it depends on the countries and how they manage disbursement. It's decentralized at the national level, so that's somewhat outside of our scope at the multilateral process. In terms of how do we get money into the hands of smallholder farmers, I want to make a caveat here. I think we often talk about finance as a homogenous entity and farmers as a homogenous entity. The reality is we will need to get different types of financing into the hands of different types of farmers. The same finance that goes to subsistence farmers who are smallholders is not the same as large, massive Brazilian soy and beef producers. I think the nuance in the middle, and what I think we often forget to talk about, is that a smallholder that produces a commodity that is traded on global supply chains, say a coffee or cocoa producer, is a very unique beast. They do manage to access some major global, let's say, value chain finance in very unique and particular ways. And so the spectrum of finance is wide. And the question of how do we get more finance into the hands of smallholders has many underlying assumptions behind it. I think what we really need to be asking is why? Why are we trying to get money into the hands of smallholders? Are we trying to connect them to commercial value chains? Are we trying to boost production? Are we trying to improve basic subsistence? Those all have different answers. And so I don't think there's a simple, quick, just do this and that and you'll just get more money flowing. I think we really need to understand what money for what are we rewarding farmers for, et cetera, et cetera. And that will unlock much more interesting questions about funding flows at scale.
Matthias, I'm going to come on to you in a minute. I just want to kind of interject with one thing. The other thing I wanted, and perhaps this is part of your answer, but somebody answer it, is that the problem with finance and food is that, particularly just narrowing down to think about climate is that if you finance investment in solar panels or something, there is a clearer causality between that investment and some kind of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. With food, it's an absolute nightmare to try and kind of untangle all that. And sometimes greenhouse gas emissions is not the outcome, or it's a byproduct of some other outcome that you might want, So is that a particular challenge when it comes to the food system? And do you feel that there are mechanisms for overcoming that? And yeah.
Yeah, my answer was exactly in that direction, Tara. And I want to agree with Alessia. I think we have to problematize and consider the complexities of finance in a much higher scale than normally the conversations that we are having. First, there is the climate finance on itself, which is channeled through GCF and GEF and etc. Our projects for abatements, like you said, is very difficult there are no methodologies, there are very few certifiers. We can actually declare that a certain improvement in practice at the farm level has reduced X tons of carbon, right? And I think this is a challenge that will be very hardly overpassed, even with all the progress in methodologies that we have seen recently. Of course, a lot of people working on that, not declining that progress will be done, but I'm not so sure if we're going to have the planet Earth on a 4 degrees until we find a way of measuring all the carbons beyond the soil. But I think where we can actually go for inspiration to cut a lot of the processing costs, the transaction costs, is, for example, on the forest debate. The TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. People don't say that very loud, but the reasoning of its existence or of its launching is to avoid the discussions on carbon markets. Is to not need to prove at the level of the farm or the level of the indigenous community how much carbon they have to sequester, because that really doesn't matter in the end. What matters is that you have a system that provides the right incentives for people to do the right things. And that's what I think they're trying to build with the TFFF, is simplifying the way that you're channeling resources to the people that, for different reasons, we already know that they are protecting the soil, protecting the forest, in their cases, obviously the forest, but doing something that we know that it's an action towards combating climate change. How much at the farm level? I really don't think that's where the solution will be. I think we could actually get inspiration from this more innovative financial mechanisms and maybe adapt those to our circumstances of the food systems to see progress on that area. A lot of the philanthropic research now and innovation on those financing approaches is exactly on that. It's how do we cut processes to increase the amount of resources that in the end will go to the farmer. Just as an example, one of the most important programs in Brazil, credit policy, it's super simple. It's very simple. You subscribe to a bank, the bank receives resources from the state for applying for doing a certain activity, economic activity. If you are a family farmer, you have a reduced rate. If you're doing some sort of agroforestry system, you have an even reduced rate. If you're doing agroecology, you have an even reduced rate. And even with that simplified mechanism, it's still very hard to make sure that all the people who are eligible for the fund access it. There's still work to do there on how to address those difficulties. And this is a simple thing. So if we start to add paperwork to prove the amount of carbon, I think we're gonna go nowhere.
So this is, but the reporting, the verifiability of, the guy who says he is going to do agroecology, does agroecology. How does that work? And I mean, this is just the perennial challenge.
Yeah, you use proxies. You don't do third-party verification because who has money to pay for a verifier? You use certified participatory guarantee systems that you trust a certain community and the community self-observes and
self-regulates.
surveys. Innovate.
Yeah. Alessia.
Can I just add a controversial position to that, given it's called table debates? I think we tend to think that, or we have as a community believed that we should reward farmers for ecosystem services, right? do this thing that's good for everyone else, but bad for you, and therefore you should get paid for it. I think we need to go beyond that logic to understand that there are certain actions that are beneficial to farmers and that are in fact profitable over time, and that farmers may be able to access capital, maybe not smallholders, but medium and large scale farmers may be able to access capital to do those things without being rewarded for them. And that if they do those things and they can pay for it themselves because fundamentally they're reimbursing a loan, maybe it's not so important that we track to the nth degree, as Matthias is saying, the exact amount of carbon retention in the soil, but rather that we do that first. Let's get that over the hurdle. Let's do the basic, lowest common denominator or low-hanging fruit stuff first. And let's get farmers to fund it on their own. And then let's get to the bits where, okay, you know what? We really need agroforestry in these areas and farmers are going to suffer a loss because of whatever reason. That's where we should be checking deeply, creating these conditionalities, but we might not need to do that always. And I think that's more where the space is moving towards at the moment.
So kind of open the door that's already a little bit open anyway, in a sense. Help push it open. Yeah. Okay. So another question, sorry, I'm just getting them up here. Yes, this is from Dinah Rosin. When I see urban initiatives like the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, I'm wondering how to position those within the broader context of national or global systems. Evaluation and social impact are hard for me to understand. I've been skeptical about the potential of urban agriculture. Where would you put energy and resources with the goal of public health and food sovereignty? So I think maybe I would interpret this question in the context of thinking about different scales of institutions all having to act together, from the kind of the kind of trans-urban level down to the national level, the international stakeholder level. So I guess the question is, how do these initiatives fit together? Is it even possible to try and do that?
Yeah, Tara, I can have a go at this. I think Gain is a member of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and I think there were meetings earlier in the month on this, actually. I mean, cities are obviously really important. They're both, they have a huge environmental impact, and we know that that will increase as more and more people live in cities. And that also means they present a huge opportunity for us to do lots of interesting things. One thing I'd highlight just reading the question is that that's not only about urban agriculture. In fact, urban agriculture is probably only a very small part of the solution. What I'd really think about is the connections between what you can do in a city and the effect that that would have on the rural environment around that city. Take, for example, big shifts in urban procurement, like we've seen in New York, where New York City wants to procure healthy and sustainable food in all kinds of public spaces. Imagine the impact that then has on the farming communities that provide food. It creates, as we've been talking about all through this session, that incentive for the farmers to do the right thing. In fact, I could have used Brazil as an example as well with Alimentacidades. Sorry, Matthias, for my pronunciation, which is a similar program on focusing on the diets in cities, but obviously then with co-benefits for production around. And, I think that when we're working on cities, we should bear in mind that they are a crucial part of the system. So they absolutely connect both sort of upwards, as it were, into these multilateral processes, and also, again, downwards, as it were, to the rural areas, the farmers, the smallholders. So they're just one really useful intervention point where it's great that we have lots of people working, not to the exclusion of any others, but just a really useful thing for us to be working on alongside the direct support to farmers, the high-level policy, and other bits aside. I'm sure that Alessia and Matthias have more to add, but I hope I'm understanding the question well. And yeah, I think, a good opportunity also to address, by the way, things like food loss and waste, which is concentrated heavily in cities, at least food waste is. So yeah, a lot we can do in that setting, if I understood you well.
Any further comments on that? Okay, here's a question from Rebecca Perez Flores, who is going to take you off on a slightly different tangent. She's saying, thank you very much for an interesting talk. What is the impact of animal ethics on COP? Has it changed over time? So I think this goes back to the livestock question, but it kind of connects it with a wider set of concerns. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
I can comment from the philanthropic perspective. There is very interesting debates going on how to position ourselves vis-a-vis the ethics of livestock. I'm not so sure about how this has been reproduced in side COP discussions. I would guess that not as much as it should, but there is discussions. I just want to make this connection with our own work on that, because interesting enough, livestock or animal farming is one of the most controversial topics everywhere, and is also inside the philanthropic community. And there has been an intense debate on what is our position on that. Fortunately, after a lot of consultations and a lot of hard talks among ourselves, we have now like a position paper which sets some principles on how we assess, for example, this or that solution. So it's not an easy answer to say we have to avoid all animal production, nor an easy answer that we just have to reform the current system. It's something in between, very much like avoiding any industrial system, or profoundly reforming industrial systems the way they are right now. I will put it in the chat what I meant by this positionality there. I don't know if my colleagues know more about how this play out inside the COP negotiations. I'm a little bit uninformed.
Maybe just on the specific point about the ethics, because I mean, the animal source food discussion is quite live. Only in parts of COP, by the way. I always think we should be cautious here. The topics of this kind of level of detail, a specific part of a specific sector, don't really come up in the main negotiations. You won't really hear about that in the adaptation or mitigation work programs, but around the COP in other areas, you might hear about livestock. But I would generally say that you hear about livestock and animal source foods in the context of their nutritional potential benefits and harms and their environmental merits and demerits. Much less so within the COP, but with a view to talking about animal ethics, maybe the full extent to it being that often we make comparisons about effectively how many chickens you would have to kill to get the equivalent amount of meat that you would get from a cow, for example, to then bring in the fact there is a trade-off there. But I don't think the ethics conversation has really moved beyond the people standing at the entrance to COPs who are often advocating throughout the fortnight for an end to animal agriculture. Maybe just because it's not an area where multilateral agreement is very likely. It's more likely to be something where different countries and even different communities within those countries have very diverging views.
Yeah, and Oliver, I mean, I think I noticed when you were talking earlier about the kind of what you might say as a kind of hierarchy of shift away from ruminant meat towards poultry meat, and I slightly, pricked my ears a bit there, because not only are the animal ethics issue, but there are different sets of environmental problems. And then zooming out to think about the role of an organization like GAIN, which is very nutrition focused in the global south. I think that's a whole other webinar that it would be lovely to do at some point. I'm aware that we're low on time. Alessia, did you want to come in on anything around animal ethics? No. Okay.
Experts. Yeah, I've just put some information in the chat for those who want to follow up.
Thank you. There's gonna be a load, and we'll make sure it's all up on the website. We've only got a few minutes left, and what I wanted to do in the last couple of minutes was just go round to each of you in turn. And again, I'm really pleased that you're quite a kind of positive bunch of people, and I'd like to keep that theme going to the very end. And I wanted to ask you, if you had a vision of a good food system of success in 30 years' time, can you try and describe what success for the food system might look like? And just to kind of get it a little bit of a harder question is, what will we need to have done in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time in order to achieve that successful outcome? And what will the role of COP be in that? That's a big ask. Even if you answer a bit of that, I'll be very happy.
So we all
Somebody wants to go first.
Exactly. We're all thinking, just give us a minute while we think about it. I'll have
Absolutely.
a go at that, and that will mean that my colleagues can give much better answers than mine, and we'll end on a high. So a vision for 2035. Well, I think there is an important piece on the demand side. So I think that there needs to be some degree of shift in the way that we think of food, the way that we look at food, and what we expect food to do with that for us. We want food that is good for our health. Obviously, it has a hugely important social element, cultural element, and of course, we should want food that hasn't been destructive to produce in terms of environmental outcomes, or indeed sort of socioeconomic outcomes. So I think the way that we look at food would be different, and we would really be thinking about our diets as a tool for doing good for locally, personally, locally, individually, within the family, within the community, and globally, right? Now, that would be the sort of long way off where we need to get to. But in the meantime, 5 years, 10 years from now, the first thing that we absolutely need to do is reduce the destructiveness of the current food system in all regards. But that means heavy investment and heavy effort into addressing the environmentally unsustainable practices, including deforestation, which means, producing, as I said earlier, more food on less land with a lower impact, lower levels of fertilizers and pesticides, embracing things like agroecology and nature-based solutions in order to be able to do that. And as we do that, also slowly shifting demand through both channels. We mentioned public procurement earlier, maybe social protection, but also through what people are choosing to buy at market so that they can increase dietary diversity, so that we can have healthier diets in places like where I am in the south of England. And as we do that work on the production side and the demand side, hopefully we can also reap some of the co-benefits. We can cut food loss and waste because we respect our food more, and we're able to achieve that multiple co-benefit kind of idea, right? The good for health, good for the environment, good for the economy, and good for all of us. I hope I'm not just packing in everything into one answer, Tara, but I think we can get there with some short-term effort, but also with a bit of a shift in our way of thinking about the food system over the longer term.
I think that was very credible effort on a big question. Quickly, each of you two.
Basically, if Oliver's president, we'll have fixed the food system by 2035.
Yeah.
So everybody vote for Oliver is my final pledge. No, I just wanted to offer a metaphor, which is I think we're at the stage where we have all the pieces of the puzzle, but the puzzle isn't forming into one big picture of change. And right now there's a mountain, and people are talking about the mountain as a group of rocks, as a snowy peak, as different things. And we have too many names for the same thing. We need to really consolidate as a community around the few key changes that we want to see, and that's what Oliver has suggested. Sustainable and regenerative production, shifts to more plant-based proteins and diets. Fundamentally, let's start there. Let's consolidate the puzzle pictures. And then I think let's move to implementation. So if over the next few years we can start demonstrating some real clear solutions on what does it mean to fix the mountain, to solve, to make the river flow. Like, I think if we can move in that direction over the next 5 years, we'll have learned a lot. And that's fundamentally the change that I think we need to see.
Thank you. Mateus.
Yes, I had 2 minutes more, but I'm not so sure if my answers will be as good. I think the first one is easy. The vision, institutionally speaking, we have 7 principles which define the vision that we want for food systems. I initially subscribed to that as a staff member, but now I really subscribe to that on a personal basis. I think they are really good.
Yeah.
We need food systems that are diverse, inclusive, resilient, equitable, interconnected, renewable, and healthy. And how to get there, I would point to a bit more technical. I think until 2030, we have to really make this action agenda live, and we have to connect the action agenda implementation plans with other international agreed implementation plans, including, for example, the UNCCD and the UNCBD commitments, the food system pathways, and the policy recommendations from the Committee on World Food Security. So that would be my suggestions of a homework for the community. And if you look towards 2040 or 2050, if we can really dream big, I would dream that in 20 years, we really account for the externalities of our food systems, and we change fundamentally the incentives that are determining the economic decisions based on a better understanding of those externalities. So we don't need to create innovative policies because the economy will be reordered. But maybe that's dreaming too big. Let's see if we can get there in 20 years or 30 or 40 or 50. I'm optimistic, as you can see by my message.
Well, I think that was a great set of answers. So, and very optimistic conclusions. So, yeah, I just remains for me now to say thank you very much. Thank you also for all the resources that you've posted in the chat. I think it's a really useful set of resources, and we'll make them available to the website. And to thank our audience, and to to wish you good night. Many thanks, and have a good evening or day.
So much, Tara.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
It was
it.
great.